Hi, Misha here, and happy Thanksgiving. Give or take exactly when I post this. And you guys have been very supportive the last couple of weeks around here, and it definitely is appreciated and noticed. And been trying to do AK videos, stuff that people like. But for Thanksgiving, I wanted to do something for me and you both, but just kind of more of a particular interest of mine, and revisit the Japanese so-called Arisaka. With about 6.5 million made over a 50-year time frame, and in service for as long, then you have to wonder, this is the original. How did this turn into something like this? Even though we call the Type 99s Arisakas, really they're not, and that's not even being pedantic mechanically. If anything, we maybe should call them Nagoyas or Nambus. We'll get into it. We're going to go over kind of the highlights, the histories. I'm going to tell stories. This is just a very informal video, just talking about something that I really enjoy. So, join with me, won't you? And as always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe, especially on these kind of CNR military videos. All the views, all the comments help a lot, because these are more passion projects than any kind of content making gonna get a lot of attention, which is a shame. These Japanese guns are fascinating, but they were so underappreciated or even outright ignored for so very long, which is really how I got into them in the first place. And I lucked into getting into them with two guns that looked almost identical to these. A Type 30 and a very, very late final series 99. We'll get there. So let's dive in and go back right after the Meiji Reformation, Restoration, and Japan's remarkable ability to modernize, adapt, and its desire to become a global power. But yeah, this is the original, the true Arisaka, the Type 30. I could have started the video with the Murata, you know I have one. And that's really where the story begins. Japan would start purchasing guns from Europe in the 1870s. In the 1880s, though, they actually started building their own at the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal, Koishiga. And this is remarkable considering their essential lack of a firearms industry just a couple of decades earlier, and that they weren't just copying or whatnot, but kind of taking the best designs. Now, the Type 13 and Type 18 Muratas were black powder. The Type 22 was a smokeless, or at least a semi-smokeless, 8mm round rimmed, and it was a magazine tube-fed gun. But firearms technology is rapidly advancing, and they know they need something much more competitive. Again, global power, and as it turns out, their timing was good because they were going to need modern guns. Now, going back, this program started off towards the end of 1895. And just a few years before, a up-and-coming officer, I believe he was a captain or a major at the time, Arisaka, went to work at the Tokyo Arsenal and would kind of climb the ranks and become a chief designer. He was a colonel by 1895 and was assigned the task with a team to develop a replacement for the Type 22 Murata for the Japanese Army. And the earliest prototypes came already by 1896 and were known as the Type 29. Now, the types are based on the reign of the current emperor, in this case, the Meiji Emperor. So the 29th year, it's a little more complicated than that. You can look it up. And they would test throughout that year and into the year 1897, making several small but important updates. And then the updated version would be adopted here as the Type 30. And then they would do another round of testing and final improvements, more to do with getting them ready for manufacturing, because they weren't just designing a new rifle. Oh no. They were designing a new cartridge. And they were really still modernizing their manufacturing setup at the Tokyo Arsenal. So it wasn't until late 1898 or early 1899 full-scale production was up and running. So what we have here is a gun that took inspiration from a few sources in Europe. They were perfectly happy to borrow. It's obviously a long rifle, over 50 inches, and the barrel is over 31 inches. Has pretty standard unprotected front iron sights and a very tall ladder rear. And if you include the top notch here, it goes up to 2,000 meters. Battle notch fold down. So even though it's pretty long, it's actually pretty svelte, pretty light, at about 8 3/4 pounds unloaded. It has a nice semi-pistol grip stock, something that a lot of guns didn't feature, and it has these tangs, top and bottom, that really do a good job of reinforcing the stock here, which is a very common weak point of a military gun. It makes kind of sense. Metal butt plate and bottom sling mounts. Now this is, of course, a bolt action turn bolt. With its bolt here, there's pros and cons to doing on the swing. Really inspired by the German 88 commission rifle as we know it. Extractor, ejector, rotating head, fixed bolt. And the magazine was actually copied from something at the time very new, the design that Mauser first debuted in his model 1893, an internal 5-shot double stack double feed. Even removable with a button here. Fun fact about these Type 30s, they use just like a wire coil type spring in the magazine. And of course the cartridge was known as 6.5 by 50 semi-rimmed. Wasn't a rimmed, wasn't a rimless, kind of like a 32 auto, it was in between. And it was inspired, almost copied, but still different from the Carcano's 6.5 by 52 in Italy. But there were other 6.5s, so take it as it will. Bolt handle knob have spot for the chrysanthemum on top of the receiver. That's the symbol of the emperor. A lot of different reasons why they aren't always intact. And what gives this one kind of its unique name is the safety back here, the hook safety. It's actually quite easy to use. Effectively, not only it's a safety, it actually decocks the gun and can be used as a manual decocker too. I like that on guns. I don't like dry firing guns. And of course it could be fed with stripper clips, which again, kind of borrowed from Mauser and was a pretty new, novel idea for that day and time. So you can see where they did their picking, but they were really pushing forward, and quality was quite good. And the Army was able to re-equip very quickly. And while this infantry rifle was expected to arm the majority of the soldiers, there was a need for a specialist carbine. The Type 30 carbine was not designed concurrently with the Type 30 rifle. Rather, they worked kind of things out with the rifle and then very soon switched over at Tokyo to developing a carbine with early prototypes towards the beginning of 1899. Essentially, it's a scaled-down gun. same bolt system. Interestingly, originally did not have an upper handguard, which is more common than you'd think in that era. In fact, a lot of the early Carcanos didn't have an upper handguard. A lot of the early French. This was a thing. Now, one thing they did do, for the first time, it had a protected front sight to kind of keep it from snagging. And side sling mounts. Same 5-shot internal magazine. It's a handy little gun. The barrel's just under 19 inches. Overall length of just under 38 inches. And it weighs not a whole lot over 7 pounds, give or take. Last round hold open on the follower on these guns. And originally, the concepts, the prototypes, did not have this bayonet lug. But by the time these were introduced for service and put into production in August of 1899, there would be a lug, and this would be a standard feature. Because while it was felt the cavalry didn't need it, because they had sabers, other people needing a lightweight gun for kind of self-defense, like the signal corps, engineers, maybe artillery crews, they need a lug. This is a relatively forward-thinking notion for that day and time, because a lot of nations were still doing separate guns for these different divisions. Oh, and by the way, it does have a shortened rear sight. Instead of out to 2,000 meters, it is only to 1,500 for rather obvious reasons. And thanks to the 6.5 being a very flat, straight shooting, gentle cartridge, it didn't wallop you too much, didn't kick you too much. All right, so by 1900, we have a long rifle for the bulk, and we have our carbine here for cavalry and others. And really by 1900, 1901, the Army was fully transitioned over to this from older Muratas. And that's because they didn't build that many. Only about 45,000 carbines were made. Just over 554,000 long rifles. So let's just say 600,000 total. Why so few? Well, again, because they're just equipping the Japanese army. And at that time, the army was still modernizing and growing, so they still didn't have that many frontline soldiers, and of course some could still use old Muratas for training and background purposes. But they would still keep building these for a few years, keeping guns in and out of circulation. But there's a whole other branch, the Japanese Navy. And they did not adopt the Type 30. First off, there's always inter-service rivalry. This is going on today and was going on then. Secondly, the Navy kind of got second fiddle and would do so for decades to come when it came to small arms, because their funding, when it came, was for things like battleships. And they was kind of wondering what their need was. So they're expected just to kind of make do with Muratas, not just 22s, but even some older 18s for a while. Secondly, the Army ended up getting to try these out in the field pretty early on in the Boxer Rebellion in 1899. Now, of course, their big combat debut would come in 1904 with the Russo-Japanese War, but we're not there yet. There have been some theoretical problems and some actually shown in field testing. For example, the commission rifle Action had a lot of small parts. This is not an easy one to disassemble. The extractor, the ejector aren't always the strongest. Dust and grime and snow and ice can get in the Action. Not everyone liked the style of sights. There were just issues. Heck, there were already starting to be reports of the 6.5 millimeter, which started off as a round-nosed bullet, maybe not being the most potent, and that those would kind of just increase as testing would go on. But eventually, the Navy had to acquiesce and admit they needed something new. But maybe luckily for them, they wouldn't have to settle for just a Type 30. No, at Tokyo, they've been working on an improved variation for a couple of years at this point. In comes the Type 35. And generally, it's still an Arisaka action, but it has improvements. But Colonel Arisaka really didn't have anything to do with this. I read different accounts, most of them saying that he thought his rifle was good as it was and didn't need improving. The powers that be disagreed. Therefore, a young captain that had worked under him briefly was kind of given the design criteria of making it a better gun. That would be Kijiro Nambu. I know his name. So this is an Arisaka with some Nambu fingerprints. Now, still has a 31 and some change barrel, still 50 overall. It's a little heavier, thanks to some changes. So it's about 9 pounds unloaded, still fires the 6.5, still a round nose bullet. But now we have a very different rear sight that kind of lifts up. Kind of reminds me of a Swiss Schmidt Rubin, at least the original. Different style upper handguard. And we have a dust cover, but it's a manual one. You probably recognize it more from the Siamese Mauser, which was also produced and designed at Tokyo. So it's at least something. And you'll notice it has the plum-shaped bolt handle. And the bolt is in some ways very similar and very different. The safety is enlarged with checkering, and the extractor and ejector have been subtly improved. But still, the design taken from the commission rifle, frankly, quite fiddly, especially to do a detailed disassembly, even if it was made a little more robust here. Still has a hold back on the empty. Still has a magazine. But now we have a more of a leaf spring than a coil in it. Get that in there. And otherwise the same. And they just made this in the long rifle variant. Took the same Type 30 bayonet. And they produced a little over 38,000 for the Navy. Again, they didn't have the best need for one, just landing forces, Marines. And it was only produced for about 2 to 3 years. This is a Type 35, meaning it was the 35th year of the Emperor, 1902 when it was adopted, and it would be produced through 1904, give or take. By the way, that enlarged safety is kind of a two-edged sword in my opinion. It's easy enough to grab and rotate this way, but when you do it like this, let go, it kind of gets your finger there, whereas it didn't earlier. There's not much of a gap as on the previous 30, so yeah. But this is essentially a Type 30 with a few updates, but we do see some elements that would be carried forward really until World War II production. For example, this plum cocking handle. And both guns would see service in 1904, 1905 in the Russo-Japanese Wars we mentioned, and that's really where their shortcomings were noticed. Things we've been talking about in minor ways. Yeah. By the way, the manual dust cover, you just have to kind of latch back. So the roughly 640,000 produced so far were enough to equip frontline troops. Second line troops training still use Muratas. And they knew something had to be different. Also, the idea of your Navy and your Army using a more or less different gun with not a lot of interchangeable parts, that's not good. You need to standardize. Luckily, just like with the Type 35, Tokyo's been working behind the scenes. They're pretty good at that. So, a solution would come very quickly, not just for the rifle, but for the 6.5 cartridge. By 1906, Japan, a nation that just half a century earlier really didn't have a modern firearms industry at all, began offering what was maybe the best military bolt action of all time. Certainly in the top 5. Of course, I mean the Type 38 Arisaka, 38 year of the reign, named for 1905 when it was finally standardized. So just right after the end of Type 35 production and Type 30 for the Army and Navy. And this would be standardized for both. They would both adopt it. And they just kind of took what worked. It has the plum bolt handle from the 35. It also has the kind of coil, the kind of leaf style spring replacing the coil. The rear sight is a return to the Type 30 style, but it no longer has the notch on top. The stock is a little bit of a hybrid of both. Overall length is just right at 50 inches. Barrel length is maybe just a tiny hair longer at about 31.5 inches. Overall length, weight is about the same, frankly, under 9 pounds. But this works so much better because this is a whole new bolt. We have an automatic top cover now, which gets a little bit derided today, but it actually served a useful purpose considering where the Japanese troops were fighting in the Russo-Japanese War, experiences there, East Asia, islands. And the nice thing is you can take it off if you don't need it. Before we get that though, the hook safety was replaced by an ingeniously simple safety where you just press in and rotate. I would argue one of the best safeties of a bolt gun for military, and the reason it was done this way so you could have gloves on, mittens on. It's, you know, if your hands are dirty, sweaty, whatever. That combined with the new bolt handle gave it just a lot better ergonomics. But it didn't just stop there. Disassembly, the lever was simplified a bit. Instead of pressing in, you pull out. It's a much longer lever. Of course, your top cover comes with. If you don't want it, boom, comes off. There it is. But this bolt is a whole new design. Very much inspired by the 1893 and later Mausers. We have a rotating extractor, long style. The ejector's in the gun now, single piece, and it's just dirt simple. You've got your extractor here, and then there's your safety. There's your firing pin, and inside, there's your spring. That's it. So for field stripping, you have essentially 4 components, and I think in total, there's only like 6 parts to this. So they went from a very, very fiddly to just keep it simple, stupid, in the best possible way, and I'm just a big fan of that. See, it goes back together very easily. Now, some people will say that the dust cover can complicate things. It can, but again, if you really don't want it, you can just not reinstall it. These were serial to the guns at this point, so When something is properly fitted, it goes back on no problem. I think the problem people run into is when you have the wrong type of dust cover, or at least a non-serial one, where it's just too loose, too tight. Of course, you still have the Royal Chrysanthemum, or you would. Again, a lot of these get taken off guns for property. So the rifle was introduced in 1905, being manufactured by Tokyo. And they learned their lesson the first time. So concurrently with this, they were also developing its little brother, the Carbine. Alrighty, picking this up the next day because we were losing light and neighbors were coming home and I was getting tired. But we get to talk about one of my favorite little variants. Here again is the Type 30 Carbine we just looked at. Hook safety, again, no upper handguard on this one. I've seen some later ones that had them. I don't know if they were added retroactively or later in production. You know, these were made in such small numbers, it's kind of hard to know. Chambered for the 6.5, the original round-nosed side sling mounts. Although this was the first Arisaka to introduce the protected front sight, a feature that would really gain popularity. But yeah, they learned their lesson. With the Type 30, they kind of put off getting the carbine going until the rifle was going. They did the same thing with the Murata Type 22. But with the 38, again, not really made by Arisaka at this point himself. He's kind of out. And now Major Nambu is heading the team at Tokyo, but it is a team effort. And this gets the same treatment. Now, this is put into production slightly later than the Type 38 rifle, even if it was accepted at the same time in 1905. It doesn't seem like it really went into production to 1906 and took a little while to get out. It also doesn't seem like the Navy got many of these, if any. It seems like while they did get plenty of the 38 longs, they didn't get many of the 38 carbines. Now, these were designed for cavalry troops, and they were designed for engineers, signal corps, artillery, transport, just anyone needing a light little gun. And this is a light little gun like the Type 30. It is slightly longer in the barrel at about 19.1 inches versus just under 19 for the 30. And it seems like it gives it just a slightly longer overall length of about 38 inches. And it's maybe, you know, I want to say it's heavier, but on the other hand, it may not be because of the internal changes in the different receiver. They are really close. It's a little over 7 pounds, 7 pounds and some ounces. A full-length upper handguard was now standard. We have the same protected front sight, short cleaning rod, Type 30 bayonet mount is standard. They didn't even play around like with the Type 30 on the prototype stage of maybe not doing a lug. They knew at this point it's just better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. Standard side sling mounts. Note the flat butt plate. Note the notch rear sight. Try not to knock the camera. Just like on the Type 30, it's a shorter ladder, I believe going up to 1,500 meters, so 1,600 yards. And mum, top cover, desk cover, same deal there. And of course the same style of push button magazine release for the floor plate. It has the same leaf spring in there and finger groove handguard. Or forestock. Now these are made at Tokyo, who at this time was pretty much the primary maker, almost the only maker of firearms for the Japanese Army, even Navy. But they were enough. It was a big enough factory, and it was still a growing young military that they would crank these out. And they would definitely make these in larger numbers than the Type 30 carbine, although ironically, you're still seeing roughly a 10-to-1 ratio. It's just last time we made far fewer Type 30s. And for a few years, the Type 38 was good enough. And in a lot of ways it would be. In fact, production would outstrip World War I a great deal. But around 1910, things were changing. Now, one change that came in, I mentioned earlier, the 6.5 bullet was very accurate, very flat shooting, very low smoke and recoil. It was a good round in some sense, but it was felt to have maybe not the best penetration, even through clothing. So they adopted a Spitzer bullet. That wouldn't make Japan at all the first. Really, Germany pioneered the way, France pioneered the way, but well before World War I, they adopted a Spitzer round. And so you start seeing guns like the Type 38 Carbine and the Type 38 rifle. You even see some Type 30s, mainly the long rifles, get updated sights for the Spitzer round, although I don't know how often that was actually used. Oh, one thing I almost forgot. The safety compared to the rifle. It is a convex notch, or bump, I should say, but it's much smaller than the rifle. Pretty obvious reason why, anti-snag. Same reason we have the protected front sight. Sorry about that, guys. But yeah, this was good. In fact, troops were really liking it, and the military was modernizing. And, well, sometimes it was felt like maybe trying to carry a carbine and a Type 32 Cavalry Saber, yeah, there's better ways to do it. In 1911, the 44th year of the reign of the Meiji Emperor, testing was completed, and this carbine, or cavalry rifle, if you prefer, variant was approved for service as the Type 44, even though it really didn't go into production and service until at least 1912. And again, made at Tokyo. It is more different than you might think, although it definitely starts off identical to the base Type 38 carbine here. The most noteworthy thing is, of course, this bayonet, but it's not the only thing. Yeah, this was designed so that they didn't have to carry a separate saber. Now, I should point out that just because they designed this for the cavalry doesn't mean that all in the cavalry would go to it. Some would still retain their Type 38s and want their sabers. But a lot did want to go to this, especially those serving in more remote areas and whatnot, where, storage and weight was at a premium. So we have this assembly running under the barrel. We have this piece that kind of clamps on. Now, one fun thing, if you notice, the barrel sticks out here. So it's not just a standard Type 38 carbine barrel. The front sight is quite far back, and just the profiling is very different. Although the barrel length is essentially the same. This might just be, again, a tiny hair longer. Notice how tight this bayonet is, even 100 years after this gun was made. And when it locks in, it is just solid. It even has this hook to kind of replicate a standard blade bayonet like the Type 30. Some say it was for sword breaking and all that. I don't know. I think it's just the hook quillion. I think it would definitely be useful as a stacking swivel, even if it wasn't intended for that, but I expect it was. And this kind of cruciform three-way bayonet, it's pretty good reach. Again, under the barrel, nice cutout on the wood. That, of course, required a very different stock. Like I said, there's more differences in this than you might think. You just press it in. Now it will lock in, but to release it, of course, you have to press in and then fold it, and it latches there. Again, fold it up. There's no rattle on this one. Just a very, very sturdy mechanism. So moving back, a smaller difference. The barrel band, the swivel, is actually angled down. Again, more for cavalry use. Full length upper handguard, short rear sight. Same dust cover, same receiver assembly essentially. 5-round internal mag, and pretty much the same side sling mount. And you might think, well, it's the same flat butt plate, but it's not. Flipping it over, you'll see this little thing there. That's actually for the rim of a 6.5 cartridge, so you can rotate this neat little trapdoor in the stock. In there are 2 holes to store 2 cleaning rod sections. That's because obviously there's not a place for a rod under the barrel here. A very thoughtful little gun. So it's kind of an all-in-one package. Bayonet, cleaning rod. You have your dust cover to keep the crud out. Same overall length. Now you are adding some weight. Wikipedia has the weight on this wrong. They say it has the same weight as the Type 38 Carbine. It does not. The stock is a little beefier up here. The wraparound bayonet assembly is definitely adding weight. Even this butt plate style with the trapdoor adds weight. So this is about 8 pounds, a little more. In fact, it's maybe even closer to 8.5. Hard to say, as later on in the video we'll see there are variations of this, so the first variation versus second versus third, they technically weigh a little different. Oh, fun fact, you'll see drain holes appearing in a lot of the Japanese stuff, again, because of where they're fighting. But no, these were put into production 1912 and entered into Army service. I do not believe at all the Navy had any. If they did, it was very small numbers. This was just primarily for the Army. Meant for cavalry, but like I said, transport crews really like these two, especially as time would go on. Made a great little PDW, and these are produced in reasonably large numbers, smaller than the Type 38 Carbine, definitely smaller than the rifle, but I mean, Tokyo Arsenal, who would produce these throughout World War I and beyond, would make 55,000 of just this variation. Now, to be fair, this is the most common variation, but not the only one, and so, as with the Type 38 Carbine itself, production would last into World War II, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself there. But since we were talking bayonet with the Type 44, let's bring out the Type 30 again. Because its bayonet, the Type 30, again, both adopted in 1897, would set the stage and really be the bayonet for Japan. Very obvious because of Japanese culture. Hooked, quillion, crossguard, bird's head grip, originally steel scabbard. The blade originally could be polished or blued. Overall length about 20 inches, with the blade being a little under 15 and a half, 16. Fullard, single edge. Pretty standard lug. Standard lug, of course, like I said, these weren't necessarily serial matched to their guns, but you will get some that will fit better than others. I mean, with production on the bayonets lasting as long as it did, you're going to get into tolerance issues. And this, of course, made a very, very long package. In fact, I don't know how well we'll be able to see this on camera, but I'm not a very tall person. In fact, I'm probably good as a representative of a Japanese from this era. But yeah. But of course, the flip side is it gave quite a good length, almost serving kind of as a pike. Let's see it on a shorter gun. There we go. Grab the 38 Carbine. Putting it on here. This is honestly a lot easier to do if you're holding a rifle naturally versus, you know, at a weird angle on a camera. Yeah, it goes on, nice tight fit. And on a carbine, it too gives a pretty good length. By the way, I'm resting the butt plate on my foot because I don't want it on the ground. But yeah, you see, even on a carbine, it's pretty good. Pretty good. And let's go to the table and actually compare the length with the Type 44, and then talk about kind of the fate of this first generation of Arisakas. How about that? I actually had to use pretty much the whole length of the table. And here they are. As you can see, the bayonet is slightly, and I do mean ever so slightly longer, but not enough to matter. The convenience on the 44 versus the 38, and overall having a lighter set of gear makes sense if you needed that. And just because the Type 30 on top, you can see it's essentially the same length and would be all that as well. It is funny though that they get heavier as time goes on, but they would also, produce them in more numbers. I mean, more of just this variation of 44 were produced in the entire 30 Carbine series, but of course nothing holds a candle to how many of the 38s they would produce. And that's kind of getting into the story of the Great War, World War I, because Japan was definitely a participant. And the fact that some of the Allies didn't acknowledge that in the 1920s was one of the many contributing reasons to animosity. Here they are, all laid out. Essentially a 15-year progression. And, the Muratas were already pretty impressive for Japan to make, considering their lack of arms industry, design, development. But they were at most adequate. They were on par with what Europe was doing, give or take a few points. But to go to the Arisaka and the 6.5 cartridge was a leap forward. Even with the Type 30 in the year 1895, the internal box magazine, and even though I would say the bolt system was a little bit antiquated, being based on the commission rifle, it wasn't useless. Keep in mind the Mauser 98 wasn't out yet, and the slim stock, and yeah, I think the cartridge helped it quite a bit, even though it was still a round nose. And they went very quickly to a carbine, even if it wasn't 100% in the cards initially, and they did a very good carbine. It's good that they went with the bayonet lug instead of doing what a lot of nations did, where they had two different styles. And having the essentially 19-inch barrel, a little short, but it was adequate for 6.5. A lot of nations were going a little bit shorter then. This is pre-short rifle phase, and it worked. And then, of course, the Type 35, it's kind of the odd one out. It has a lot of weird features, like the rear sight and the dust cover really aren't fantastic. But then again, going to the spring, the leaf spring in the magazine, and the reshaped bolt handle, that was nice. On the other hand, I don't really think the safety is an improvement, personally. And even though they strengthened the bolt, this is what really showed that the commission style just wasn't where it was at. But then the 38 comes along and just sets the trend for really the rest of Imperial Japan and their firearms development. And this fixed everything, especially once the Spitzer cartridge joined it, and is rightfully lauded as one of the best military bolt actions of all time. In fact, that's why it would essentially continue on through World War II, just with a new cartridge. Of course, it's good that they knew that they needed a Type 38. And the 44 just shows that they were willing to have specialist guns for smaller rate productions, something we'll see later in World War II as well. With the Great War, what were their fates? Well, the Army still officially had the Type 30 in frontline service, and the Navy had the Type 35 in frontline service, but truth is they were more reserve and training than anything else. By that point, they had enough Type 38s, 44s even, to take over main duties, but they're still there. Some of the Type 30s would be given the updated Type 38 sight. And starting in 1905, running through around 1920-21, around 10,000 Type 30 rifles would be bored out into blank fire trainers. Interestingly. And then in the war, you'd actually have some interested parties. For example, needing as many guns as they could get. For some reason they talked with the U.S., Winchester, Remington. Britain ordered 150,000 Arisakas from Japan. Now, most would be Type 38s, but some Type 30s would slip in. And most would either go to the Royal Navy, who didn't need them as frontline, just, auxiliary use, although some would be sent to the Middle East and Far East. But this would be pretty briefly in service before they would be traded off to really the biggest user outside of Japan during that war of the Arisaka, and one that actually came to really appreciate them. Tsarist Russia. They would order 500,000 Arisakas. They would get 38s, but they would actually get a lot of Type 30s and even quite a number of 35s. In fact, 250, even 300,000 of those would go to Russia over the years, meaning that more than half of all production probably went there, which explains why 30s and 35s are hard to find today. And the rest would be 38s. And in fact, by 1916, 1917, Britain would go ahead and pass on a majority of its Arisakas to Russia because they were making good use of them. And not only did they issue the rifle, the 6.5 Arisaka round made a big impression in Russia. That's why the 1916 Fedorov was chambered for it. It was a much better choice than the 7.62-54 rimmed. And it went from there. Now, of course, because Russia had them, this is how Finland would end up with quite a few. So we actually get some, not just Type 30s and 38s, but even a few 35s that came out of Finland. And even Finland gave some away because in the 1920s they were trading off the guns they had to try to standardize, and so they sent some Arisakas to Estonia. And of those, some were even reworked to fire 30-06. So, yeah, that's kind of how they first got introduced to Europe by World War I. And even though the Arisaka was originally designed for Japanese use, and in the beginning that's what their production capacity could be, after the war, you would start to see contracts, for example, Siam. But we'll get to that later on. For now, that's kind of the disposition during the war. The Type 30 and 35 were long out of production, and the Type 38 rifle and carbine and Type 44 were just getting started. I don't know how many were made by the end of 1918. I can tell you that when Tokyo stopped producing guns altogether around 1931, 1932, they had built over 2 million Type 38 long rifles, over 200,000 Type 38 carbines, and as I mentioned earlier, over 55,000 Type 44 carbines, meaning you're looking at 2.25 million of these produced. And if you include the earlier guns, you've got a production verging around 3 million Arisakas. Of course, things would change in the 30s. This isn't going to be the end. In fact, it's in some ways just the beginning. But it is the end of this kind of first stage, first generation, and this first video. Rather unintentionally, my Arisaka journey began with this model here, the Type 30, the very first one. Although not this exact gun. Though I did retain that original gun for 20 some odd years. Remember how I said that several were converted to blank fire trainers? It was one of those, but for what I paid for it back in the day, didn't care until this one came in the store during the COVID times. And it seems to not have been converted. Also, it has a pretty good marking here. Japanese mums and stuff were always defaced when they were sold, even during World War I, World War II. So any of your, Russian guns and everything, they're going to have overstamps or scratched out, because that was the imperial marking, and once it was no longer property of the emperor, they went away. But yeah, I've told the story before, but very briefly, I was on a look for both a 6.5 and a 7.7, and luckily 2 stores in a town near where I grew up had them come in the same day, so got a ride, took a trip over there, went to the place that had the 6.5 first, and it was a Type 30, almost identical to this one, except it was bored out. But I didn't know the Type 30, because a lot of my information, this is, before the internet was really going, I was using things like Tales of the Gun. That's what it was. And I thought, this is a weird safety. But I had vaguely heard of hook safeties, and I thought, there's no dust cover, but where would it go? I didn't know that this shouldn't have one. I didn't know that the handle was not plum-shaped, or I kind of thought, if that's plum, then I don't know. But I knew enough to know that it was more or less correct, but it also wasn't like a Type 38 exactly. It didn't take me long to figure out it was a Type 30, and so I was real happy when I got home to realize that I had picked unintentionally a rarer gun up. I mean, as I just said, they've made 550,000 of these, that kind of the carbines, and they made millions of the Type 38s. So I just lucked into one, even if it was a blank fire gun. I didn't care. I'm not gonna buy these to shoot. The bolts and the parts, the extractors, they're too fragile. That is something to look for if you're getting one of the early guns, especially. Make sure the bolt is complete, because a lot of times when you find these, it's missing one or both parts, or even the complete head, because it's just so easy to do. Trust me, I lost one just unwrapping a gun once. It got stuck in the guy had taken the bolt out to ship the gun, and the extractor got caught on the newspaper and was taken off when I pulled it out, and I'd thrown the newspaper away in the trash. But I called him and I said, "Hey John, there's no extractor." He goes, "Yeah, there is. Check the paper." Luckily, tell me, and the trash hadn't been taken yet, so I was that close to losing a pretty dang valuable part. And other times I used a gentleman, Don Schlickman, who made very good quality replica parts, because you gotta have something. I like to keep my guns in good repair. But yeah, my story started here, and up until a year or two ago, I had that original gun, and I kept both for a while, but I didn't really see a need to keep both. And this is a good, clean, honest example. You probably won't ever find one matching 100% correct, just because either they left Japan and were reworked elsewhere, or they were kept in Japan as kind of training devices, whatever. Your best case is if a Japanese officer took one home and it sat above his mantle and then it got surrendered at the end of World War II. But that's not very common. But, this was the Arisaka that really started it all, and the one of two true Arisakas that are truly Arisakas, before Nambu started doing his thing to him. And it really proved good and bad things during the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, which was the war that put Japan on the map as certainly a regional power and even a contender for a global power, because Russia was considered to be a global power, and if Japan could wallop them the way they did, you got people a-talking. And that's really what I love these about, is the history here. Keep in mind, at this point, and as we get into World War I, Japan's our ally. That's why I decided to make this the Thanksgiving video. Fun fact, when I've been doing these swing videos by myself, I've been doing, AKs and stuff. One challenge on my first CNR video is just how long these things are. And when I was switching out guns, the edge of the gun clipped the camera, and I heard the camera rocking dunk, 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 dunk on the tripod, and I was thinking, is it gonna fall? Or it didn't fall, thankfully. So, as I said, though, I had a Type 30 and I really liked it. Ended up getting a 99 that day too, but story for another video. But I still needed a 38, and I've had several over the years, including this one. Picked this one up quite a long time ago. It's got a pretty nice chrysanthemum on it. These weren't super deeply struck at this point. Nice blued finish. Can't remember if this matches. I think it does. One thing to talk about matching on these is Koshika, Tokyo used assembly numbers, not just serial numbers. And to really, really, really know if your gun is matching, you have to actually take it out of the stock to get the assembly number on the receiver to match the serial number, because some parts just have assembly numbers and you don't know if it matches your receiver. And the problem with that is the screws are staked in place. So I don't like doing that. I'd rather keep my screws staked in. Now, I'm not saying they're all staked, but a lot of them are. I'd rather keep it original and just kind of trust, it looks right, you know. Doesn't really bother me if it's not. Again, these are old guns. And this is a good example of a earlier style production Type 38 long rifle. As we'll see in the next video, there will be changes. Point to them then. But yeah, I look for these, and I've had a few over the years. And for a while, the Type 38s sold for less than the 99s because people wanted more of that World War II look, even though these were definitely used and even made in that war. They don't have things like the aircraft sights or the monopod. But yeah, looking for one with a dust cover and the mum and the cleaning rod. Oh, fun thing about the cleaning rod, the rods for the Type 30s have brass tips, and then later on they would go to just a all blued rod. They're not screwed in, by the way. I didn't mention it. They're actually a button here you press, or just the kind of retainer, and then it pulls out. So that's pretty cool. I think there's a lot of thoughtful things. Again, Japan really nailed making guns quickly. The quick remove floor plate. If you have a different latch on one, some that were sent to like Finland and Estonia had locks on here. Some of the Russian ones, because with you wearing a glove, this is a pretty small trigger guard. At this time, they weren't really thinking so much about cold weather. They weren't in really Manchuria yet. They were thinking more tropical. So if you were in Russia, yeah, there's not a lot of room, so they were worried about accidentally hitting it and popping and dumping all your ammo on the ground, and that's no good. But yeah, the quality of these, the bluing, the Hiroshi lacquer on the wood, even though this is a two-piece stock, that's correct. Even from the early days, it's not like a last-ditch feature. Yeah, they're just nice. They really are. And I love the simplification of the bolt on these. They really did it right. Note the unprotected front sight. So I had the 30 and the 38. But there's that middle ground, the 35. And that nagged at me for years, because I wanted that intermediate step so badly, and it's so hard to find. Those that have followed the channel and followed my Japanese videos know that a Type 35 was my kind of whale gun for a while. These are just shockingly hard to find. Well, but probably not, with just over 38,000 made. Even though the Navy didn't use them a whole lot, they just got used up and beat up. They used special parts, and once worn out, were junked. A good chunk were sent to Russia. Probably just disappeared there. So not many were brought over with World War II. That's how most of our Japanese guns got over here. Not all. There were some imports and some that came back before World War II by various means, but I'd say 90-some-odd% were World War II bringbacks, give or take. I just made that number up, but sounds good, right? But I just really liked this transitional gun. The Siamese style top cover, the weird bolt, the very unique rear sight. It just intrigued me. And you'll never find a perfect one. This is the best I've been able to come up with. It has its issues. There's no mum. I think I had one once that had a mum, but the downside to it, the stock was just not just sanded a little bit. It was sanded to oblivion. I've seen sporter guns that look more restorable. It was just sanded to the nth degree, sadly. And I thought, you know, of the two, just a stock that looks horrible, but the gun has a mum, or a honest stock, frankly. I went with this. And, you know, trying to find one that's 100% matching, I don't know if that even exists. I know collectors have told me that there are certain rare guns that you just don't find matching. And that makes sense, because with so few made, I don't know how much they had in the way of spare parts, but I bet they were having to cannibalize guns to keep other guns running. But I'm happy with it. I mean, I could see maybe upgrading it in the future, but then again, I've been collecting Japanese guns for 25 years, and this is the best overall example of a Type 35 I've had. But this just really plugs the gap, and I think it's neat for anyone who likes the story of Major Nambu, later General, because this has more of his touch to it. This is also when Colonel Arisaka himself said, "I'm out." Let's end with one of the kind of coolest looking little guns, the Type 44. You know, they didn't make a ton of these. We'll talk about the rest of production from Kokura and Nagoya in the next video, but total was under 92,000. That said, there are a pretty good number in America. Part of it is a lot of them were on the home islands when surrender happened, but a part of it is too, I think a lot of GIs just looked at these and thought, that's cool. It was also small enough they could fit it in a duffel. These just seem to be popular bring-back trophies. And you'll find them in all kinds of conditions. Unfortunately, you seem to get a choice. You can either get one with worn bluing, little beat up, and a mum, or you can get one that looks virtually new, because a lot of these never left the home islands or were back for refurbishment, so it looks great, but no mum. So finding one with a mum and in good shape is, you can do it, but you have to really try. I've got a friend who's been he's passed up so many gorgeous guns because the mum's ground off. I'm like, man, just, buy a good gun now if the price is right, and if the better one comes along later, do that. And that's what I've done with these guns, and you'll see it throughout the next video on my clay. If a nice one, but maybe one or two flaws that I can live with, and it's just a matter of, can I live with them? Some I can't. Like if it's a sporterized gun, no. But maybe if it's a mismatched part, maybe. Scrub mum. I don't like it, but it doesn't bother me. There's just things. Sanded stock bugs me a lot. Honest bluing wear, not as much. Buy good enough now, and if a better example comes later, grab that. So over the years, I've traded up a number of times. This gun actually came from a son of one of the old bonsai guys when he passed, and he kind of just had a thing for Type 44s. I think he gave me like 14 or 18 to sell. I was like, my God. But what was cool is I got to examine not just a first variation and a third, but he had a second. I've got to see first variation like Kokuras and everything. So it's been fun to study them. I think it's a really neat gun. And I really do think it's cool how the bayonet works on these. Just how tight, how well they did this system. Even back then. This part will be serial to your gun, by the way, or at least early on it'll be assembled and later serialed. But yeah, you might not notice it, but the barrel is a different profile because of everything on there. So you can't just like take a Type 38 and convert it. They are different guns. But a popular gun, pretty unique, and one you found in America. This isn't the last we'll see of it, obviously. Top covers are nice too. I would say make sure if serials don't match on your cover to your gun, that's okay. But try to get a 38 cover for a 38 gun and a 99 cover for a 99 gun. Yes, there are differences. To some extent, they are interchangeable, but for proper fit and function, you're going to want to have the right, at least, style of cover. We'll talk about that next time, though, again. And, when I was getting into these, prices were very, very reasonable, even for rarer guns. It wasn't until you got to, like, the super uncommon and desirable, the paratroopers and the snipers, that money went up, but the general public just didn't have a lot of thought about Japanese Arisakas at the time. I would say by the time I was getting into guns, the dismissal of Japanese crap was kind of over. It was pretty well known in the 90s, 2000s, that this was a strong action, a good system, and that the guns had kind of been underappreciated, but still the collectors hadn't really gravitated towards them yet. So that's one reason I dove in. Another was I was interested, and I am interested. But it was also something, it was an interest I could afford. It was an affordable interest. So it worked out well. And it was something that a lot of people weren't into. A lot of folks were into Mausers and 1903s and 1 Grands, and that's great. But I didn't feel like there was anything for me to kind of get into and really dig my teeth in there and learn. Maybe I was a little late. But these, I was early, or at least on time. And so I was able to kind of put together a neat little collection. I knew some of the old-timers that you go out to their garage and they would have dozens, even 100 or more Arisakas. That's not me. I'm more of a quality over quantity. I might have 1 or 2 examples of a certain variant, but typically I trade up or around and don't need everything. Like on this, I could have kept a second pattern, second variation. I just didn't see the need. But, like I said, this is probably the 4th one I've owned, just kind of upgrading over the years. So I will do that all the time. But I don't need that huge of a collection. It would be fun, though. You can definitely do that with Japanese guns. Even with the World War I era. World War II? Definitely. But so many variations, because each little run, factory, and series, we haven't even really talked about series yet, but they would change things up. And there's a lot of hand fitting and bluing and hand lacquering. So there's some really neat variations. And I will say, too, you will find sincere factory oopsies, like serial numbers being transcribed and reversed and things. So these weren't done by machines, by computers. These were done by human beings. And that's really what I like about them. You can feel that. And again, at this point in time, Japan is our ally. British ally. Even a Russian ally at the beginning of World War I, despite the Russo-Japanese War. So, I thought this would be a good Thanksgiving video. Again, I'm a little bit doing this one for myself. I hope you enjoyed the journey with me. But, even though I love doing AK videos, HK videos, sometimes I just have to do something that makes me happy. So if this is the Thanksgiving Day video, we're going to have World War II Arisakas being our Black Friday Day video. I thought that was kind of appropriate. Plus, it'd be too long to clump them all in together. But while this may not be my absolute definitive Arisaka video, just kind of sharing my journey and what I've learned over the years and kind of where I've settled my collection. I sold off a couple during the COVID era and a couple this year because of the cabin. But I mostly sold other guns, Enfields, Springfields, Mosins. I find it very hard to sell my Japanese. I just do, because they all have a spot in the collection. They all kind of fill a niche, like that Type 35, or like this one being a first pattern. They each represent something, and I feel like if I start breaking it apart, I lose that narrative. I lose that story that I can tell you, and not just talking, but show you on video how things progress. Because I can't insert pictures. Maybe if I could, and maybe if I could look at pictures, things would be different for me. But since I can't, I need to have stuff to hand so I can see and study it, and also remind myself, because I'm human and I do forget things over the years. I really do. But yeah, if you are into Japanese Arisakas, let me know what you got, your favorites, and your white whales that you found. And if you're not, and you're just, stuffed on turkey and watching this, you might check them out. They're a lot more fun than you think. They're not just a forest of sticks, of trees without branches. They have a lot of heart and soul and craftsmanship behind them. And I like that. I like that a lot. And they're very nice guns. 6.5 is still available today. Even though I wouldn't shoot that Type 35, a gun like this, or that Type 38, No problem at all. They are plenty solid. That's not advice in case one goes kaboom, but they're as trustworthy as any 100-plus-year-old gun, made from quality steel and with all the safety features you'd expect. Now, Arisaka and really Nambu, the folks at Tokyo at the time, knocked it out of the park. So yeah. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Help us out on Patreon if you can. If not, that's okay too. You can also, I guess, super thanks on YouTube. Hope everyone's having a good holiday and has a good December as we roll into the Christmas season. This is Misha. Losing daylight, so I guess we'll catch you very soon next time. By the way, I know we're losing daylight because I can feel the sun on my face, in case someone wondered. See you then, guys. And stay tuned for part 2. I'll have it out probably tomorrow.